On a chilly evening in a bustling city, the streets buzzed with life, car horns blaring, people rushing home, and the air thick with the scent of rain that had just begun to fall. Among the chaos, there was Jamal, a 17-year-old boy with a worn backpack slung over his shoulder and shoes that had seen better days. He sat quietly on the steps of an old library, trying to shield himself from the drizzle. Jamal wasn't just any teenager, he was a survivor. Life hadn't been kind to him, but he met its challenges with quiet resilience. Homeless since he was 15, he had learned to navigate a world that often looked the other way. Tonight was like any other, cold, uncertain, and lonely. Jamal had a routine. He'd spend his days at the library, reading anything he could get his hands on. Books gave him a sense of escape, a glimpse of possibilities beyond the harsh realities of his current existence. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he'd return to the streets, searching for a safe spot to sleep. As the rain started to pick up, Jamal noticed a man across the street, struggling to push a stalled car out of the middle of traffic. He was older, maybe in his 40s, and looked desperate as other drivers honked impatiently. Jamal hesitated. Helping someone in a city where people rarely even acknowledged him wasn't something he'd often done, mostly because he hadn't been given many chances. But something about the man's expression, a mix of determination and frustration, tugged at him. Without thinking much about it, Jamal stood up, adjusted his backpack, and jogged across the slick street. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice steady despite his nervousness. The man glanced at him, surprised. For a moment, he seemed to study Jamal, his tired eyes softening before nodding. "Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, kid." Together, they pushed the car to the curb. The man caught his breath, leaning against the door. "You didn't have to do that," he said, looking at Jamal with genuine gratitude. Not many people would stop to help a stranger. Jamal shrugged, brushing off the rain that clung to his hoodie. "It's nothing. Just seemed like you could use some help." The man introduced himself as David. He was an out-of-towner, visiting the city on business, though things clearly weren't going as planned. His car had broken down, his phone battery had died, and he didn't know the area well enough to figure out what to do next. Jamal, despite his own circumstances, offered to help him find a nearby mechanic. "There's a place a couple of blocks from here," he said. "I can show you." As they walked, the two began to talk. David was curious about Jamal. He asked where he lived, what school he went to, and why he was out so late. Jamal deflected most of the questions, uncomfortable with revealing too much. But something about David's kindness made him feel safe. When they reached the mechanic's shop, it was closed. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Figures," he muttered. He glanced at Jamal again, this time with a look that was harder to read. "Listen, I don't have much on me, but I'd like to repay you somehow. Are you hungry? Maybe I can buy you something to eat?" Jamal hesitated. He wasn't one to accept handouts, but the thought of a warm meal was too tempting to pass up. "Sure," he said quietly. They ended up at a small diner a few streets over. The warm lights and smell of fresh coffee were a stark contrast to the cold, wet streets outside. Over burgers and fries, the two continued their conversation. David shared stories about his life, mentioning a career that had taken him to different cities and how he'd lost touch with some important people along the way. Jamal listened, his curiosity growing with every word. But as the conversation deepened, something strange began to happen. David's stories, his mannerisms, even the way he smiled, it all felt oddly familiar to Jamal, like fragments of a memory he couldn't quite piece together. David, too, seemed to be studying Jamal more closely now, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. By the time they left the diner, the rain had stopped, and the streets were quieter. David walked Jamal back to the steps of the library, where they'd first met. "Thanks again, kid," he said, his tone softer now. "You're a good person. Don't let this world tell you otherwise." Jamal nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing things like that. As David turned to leave, he stopped suddenly, pulling something from his pocket, a small, worn photo. This might sound strange, but you remind me of someone, he said, handing the picture to Jamal. Jamal froze as he looked at the image. It was a younger version of David, standing next to a woman who looked eerily like his mother. His hands began to shake, and his heart raced. Could it be? Before he could process what he was seeing, David said something that would change everything. Her name was Lisa. She was someone I lost a long time ago. Jamal's voice was barely above a whisper. That's my mom's name. David's face froze, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. He stared at Jamal, his brows furrowed, as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Your mom, he repeated, his voice catching slightly. Jamal nodded, clutching the photograph tightly in his hand. His mind raced, memories of his mother flooding back, her laughter, her warmth, and the stories she used to tell him when he was little. But she never talked about his father. Whenever Jamal asked, she'd simply smile sadly and say, he's not around anymore, baby. David took a step closer, his eyes scanning Jamal's face as if searching for answers. What was her last name? He asked, his voice trembling. Lisa Brown, Jamal replied. His voice was steadier than he felt, though his heart pounded in his chest. She passed away a couple of years ago. David staggered back slightly, his hand running through his hair as he processed the words. Lisa Brown, he whispered, almost to himself. I knew her. We were together a long time ago. He paused, his gaze locking onto Jamal's. You're saying she's gone? Jamal nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. Cancer. She fought it for a while, but, yeah. David's face crumpled, a wave of emotion washing over him. He leaned against the wall, his head bowed. For a moment, the world seemed to stop around them, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background. Jamal didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to comfort David, but another part of him felt overwhelmed, unsure of what this all meant. Finally, David looked up, his eyes red but filled with a strange determination. Jamal, he said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. How old are you? 17, Jamal replied cautiously. Why? David took a deep breath, his hands trembling. Because, if you're 17, and Lisa, if she's your mom, he stopped, his voice cracking. There's a chance, it's possible, I could be your father. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jamal's head spun, disbelief washing over him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His father? How could that be? All these years, he'd convinced himself that his father was either dead or didn't care enough to find him. And now, here was this stranger, claiming to be the man he'd spent his whole life wondering about. You're saying, you're my dad? Jamal finally managed to say, his voice filled with a mix of anger, confusion, and hope. I don't know for sure, David admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. But, it's not impossible. Lisa and we were together around the time you would have been born. I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had, he trailed off, his eyes pleading. I would have been there, Jamal. I swear. Jamal took a step back, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to believe David, to cling to the idea that he wasn't as alone as he thought. But another part of him was filled with doubt. How do I know you're telling the truth? He asked, his voice sharp. For all I know, you're just some guy trying to mess with me. David nodded, understanding Jamal's skepticism. You're right, he said. You have every reason not to trust me. But I'm not lying to you. I didn't come here looking for you, I didn't even know you existed. But now that I do, he paused, his voice breaking. I can't just walk away. Jamal stared at him, his emotions a whirlwind. He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what they might be. If you're really my dad, he said slowly, then prove it. David nodded again, his expression serious. I will. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. This is my number. If you ever want to talk, or if you just need anything, call me. Please. Jamal hesitated before taking the card. He didn't say anything, but the weight of the moment was clear. David looked at him one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and regret. I'm not going to push you, he said softly. But I hope you'll give me a chance. With that, David turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jamal stood there, the card in one hand and the photograph in the other, his mind spinning with questions. Could this man really be his father? And if he was, what did that mean for Jamal's future? As the city lights flickered around him, Jamal knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. Jamal sat on the library steps long after David had disappeared into the night, the card and photograph still clutched in his hands. His mind was a storm of emotions: confusion, anger, hope, and a deep ache he couldn't quite name. The photograph felt like a link to a past he'd never known, but it also stirred up questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. He stared at the faces in the picture, at his mother's warm smile and the younger version of David standing beside her. Could it really be true? Could this stranger actually be his father? He tucked the photo into his backpack and slid the business card into his pocket. The night felt colder now, the city quieter. Jamal pulled his hoodie tighter around him and tried to focus on the practicalities of his situation. He still didn't have a place to sleep tonight, and the rain-soaked streets offered little comfort. Pushing thoughts of David aside for the moment, he made his way to a nearby shelter he occasionally used when there was space. The shelter was crowded, as it often was, but Jamal managed to find a spot in the corner of the main room. He curled up on a thin mat, his backpack serving as a makeshift pillow. Around him, the murmur of other people settling in for the night created a kind of white noise, but Jamal couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept circling back to David, to the possibility that he might not be as alone as he'd always believed. Jamal's life had been shaped by loss and uncertainty. His mother had been his whole world, a fierce and loving presence who worked tirelessly to provide for him. Even when things were tough, she'd made sure he felt safe and loved. But her illness had taken everything. Watching her grow weaker, day by day, had been the hardest thing Jamal had ever faced. And when she was gone, the world had felt colder, emptier. He'd been placed in foster care, bouncing from one home to another, never quite fitting in. By the time he turned 15, he decided he was better off on his own. The streets weren't kind, but they were honest. Jamal had learned how to survive, how to find food, how to stay out of trouble, and how to keep moving forward even when it felt impossible. But survival wasn't the same as living, and there were nights, like this one, when the weight of it all felt crushing. He pulled the photograph out of his backpack and stared at it again, his fingers tracing the edges. His mother had never talked about his father, not really. Whenever he'd asked, she'd change the subject or give vague answers that left him with more questions. Jamal had eventually stopped asking, convincing himself that whoever his father was, he wasn't worth knowing. But now, seeing this picture, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd been wrong. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of people shuffling around him, the shelter stirring to life. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and glanced around. The photograph was still tucked safely in his backpack, and the business card was in his pocket, the edges slightly crumpled. He pulled it out and stared at the name printed on it, David Harper. Beneath the name was a phone number and an address. Jamal's stomach twisted as he considered his options. Part of him wanted to call, to demand answers, but another part of him was afraid of what he might find. He spent the day wandering the city, his thoughts tangled. He found himself retracing the steps he and David had taken the night before, as if walking those streets might somehow help him make sense of everything. He stopped by the diner where they'd eaten, staring through the window at the booth where they'd sat. The waitress who had served them the night before was wiping down tables, her expression tired but kind. Jamal considered going in, but he didn't know what he'd say. By late afternoon, he found himself back at the library. The familiar smell of old books and the quiet hum of the space helped calm his racing thoughts. He picked up a book from one of the shelves, but his mind kept drifting back to David. Who was he? What kind of man had his mother fallen in love with all those years ago? And why hadn't he been there when she needed him most? Jamal's thoughts were interrupted by a librarian, a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile. "You've been coming here a lot lately," she said, her voice soft. "Everything okay?" Jamal hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. Just needed a quiet place to think." She nodded, her expression understanding. "Well, you're always welcome here. If you need anything, just let me know." "Thanks," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stayed at the library until it closed, reading but not really absorbing the words. As he left, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows on the pavement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card again, turning it over in his hands. He didn't have a phone, but there were payphones scattered around the city. He'd seen one a few blocks away. His heart pounded as he approached the phone booth. He slid a few coins into the slot and dialed the number, his hands shaking. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Jamal's nerves were about to get the better of him when the line clicked. "Hello?" David's voice was calm but tinged with uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure who might be calling. Jamal froze, his throat tightening. For a moment, he considered hanging up, but something in David's tone stopped him. "It's me," he said finally, his voice barely audible. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jamal?" David's voice was softer now, filled with a mix of relief and surprise. "Yeah," Jamal said. I don't know why I called. I need to know. About you. About my mom. About everything." David's voice was steady but emotional. "I'm glad you called," he said. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want to tell you everything I can. Where are you? Maybe we can meet somewhere and talk." Jamal hesitated, glancing around at the dimly lit street. "There's a park near the library," he said finally. "I'll be there in an hour." "Okay," David said. "I'll be there." Jamal hung up, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't ignore this. As he made his way to the park, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had spent so long wondering about his father, building up walls to protect himself from the pain of not knowing. Now, those walls were starting to crack, and he wasn't sure what he'd find on the other side. The park was quiet when Jamal arrived, the evening air cool and crisp. The trees, now bare of their leaves, cast long shadows across the paths, and the dim streetlights flickered in the distance. Jamal found a bench near the center of the park, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. His heart was racing again, the uncertainty of the situation gnawing at him. What was he doing here? Was he really ready to face the man who might be his father? He glanced at the time on his phone. It was almost the hour he'd told David. Jamal's stomach churned as he tried to steady his breathing. He couldn't remember ever feeling this torn. Part of him wanted answers, but another part of him was terrified of what those answers might mean. The sounds of the city seemed distant now, and for a moment, Jamal could only hear the rustling of the wind through the trees. His thoughts wandered back to his mother. She had always been the one constant in his life, the one person who had given him everything. She had been strong, determined, and loving. But now, standing on the edge of this new possibility, Jamal wondered if he had been wrong to keep his father at arm's length. A car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights briefly illuminating the park before it came to a stop. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he stood up, watching as a figure stepped out of the vehicle. David. The man who might be his father. David walked toward him, his face more lined than Jamal had remembered, his hair graying at the temples. But there was something in his eyes, a mix of hope and fear, that made Jamal hesitate. He had seen that same look in the mirror countless times. "Jamal," David said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "I didn't know if you'd show up." Jamal didn't know what to say. His throat was tight, and the words felt stuck. He just nodded, his eyes locked on David's face, trying to find something familiar. Something that could convince him that this wasn't some twisted coincidence. David gave a small, nervous smile, then gestured to the bench. "Mind if we sit?" Jamal nodded again, sitting down slowly. The silence between them stretched out, neither of them knowing where to begin. Finally, David spoke, his voice tentative. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said. "And I don't expect you to believe everything right away. But I need you to understand that I never wanted to leave you. I didn't even know you existed until recently." Jamal's heart raced. "What do you mean? You didn't know?" His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with disbelief. "How could you not know?" David rubbed his hands together, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting Jamal's gaze. "I wasn't a good person back then," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I was young, selfish. I made a lot of mistakes. And when Lisa told me she was pregnant, I wasn't ready. I panicked. I walked away." Jamal felt a sharp pang in his chest. It was the answer he'd feared, the one he had always suspected deep down. His father had abandoned him. Just like everyone else. "She never told me anything about you," Jamal said, his voice cold. "Not a word. I grew up thinking I didn't have a father. And now you're telling me you just left? You didn't even try to find us?" David's face twisted with pain. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not proud of it. I regret it every day. But after I left, I tried to find her. I really did. I looked for her for years. But she had moved on, started a new life. I lost track of her, and then I found out she was gone. And that's when I found out about you." Jamal's eyes burned, but he didn't let the tears fall. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. That he could survive on his own. But now, sitting here, hearing this man, this stranger, tell him that he had been looking for him, Jamal didn't know what to feel. "I didn't even know your name until recently," David continued, his voice filled with regret. "I found some old papers, a letter from Lisa. She wrote about you, Jamal. She was proud of you. She loved you more than anything. And when I read that, I knew. I had to find you. I had to try to make things right." Jamal swallowed hard, trying to push down the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. His mother had loved him. He had always known that. But hearing David speak about her, about the things she had written, made the loss feel even sharper. She was gone, and now, here was this man, claiming to be the father she had never told him about. "I don't know if I can just forgive you," Jamal said, his voice raw. "You weren't there. You didn't care enough to be there when she needed you. And now, after all this time, you want me to just accept you?" David's eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said softly. "I don't deserve it. But I'm asking you for a chance. Not for me, but for you. You don't have to trust me right now. But I want to be a part of your life, Jamal. If you'll let me." Jamal turned his gaze away, looking out at the darkened park. The streetlights cast long shadows on the ground, and the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of distant traffic. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a decision. He didn't know what to do. The pain of his mother's death was still fresh, and now this man, his father, was standing in front of him, asking for a second chance. But Jamal wasn't sure he was ready to let go of the life he had built on his own. He had spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't want anyone. Could he really open up to someone who had abandoned him before? David was silent for a long time, giving Jamal the space to think. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I'm not asking for everything all at once. Just give me a chance. Let me show you who I am. Let me show you that I can be the father you never had." Jamal's heart was heavy with the weight of the decision. He didn't know what the future held, or if he could ever trust David. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe fear. He wasn't sure. But he knew one thing: his life had just become a lot more complicated. And no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Jamal sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of David's words hanging heavily between them. The night had deepened, the cold creeping into his bones, but it wasn't the chill of the air that made him shiver. It was the cold, hard reality of what he was being asked to do. He didn't know if he could trust this man, this stranger who claimed to be his father. Everything inside him screamed to walk away, to reject the idea of a family he never had. But something else, something deeper, kept him rooted to the bench, unwilling to let go of the fragile thread of hope David had offered. David was still waiting for an answer, his eyes searching Jamal's face with a mixture of desperation and hope. Jamal could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken plea for acceptance. His chest tightened, and he took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." David nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. I don't expect you to just forget everything, to forgive me right away. But I'm here, Jamal. And I'll be here whenever you're ready." Jamal didn't know what to say to that. The part of him that longed for connection, the part of him that had spent years wondering about his father, ached with the possibility of something more. But the other part of him, the one that had learned to survive alone, felt the walls inside him tightening. He didn't need anyone. He didn't need David. "Look," Jamal said, his voice shaky, "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with all this. You say you want to be in my life, but you weren't there for me. You weren't there for my mom. And I don't know if I can just pretend that doesn't matter." David's face fell, and for a moment, Jamal thought he saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "I know," David said softly. "I know I wasn't there. And I can't change that. But I can try to make things right now. I can't fix the past, but maybe I can help with the future." Jamal looked away, his eyes scanning the darkened park. He wanted to believe David. He really did. But the scars of his past, the pain of losing his mother, the years of wondering where his father was, were too fresh. They were too deep. He had built his life around the idea that he didn't need anyone, that he could make it on his own. And now, here was this man, offering him a second chance at something he had never had. A family. But the idea of a family felt foreign to Jamal. He had survived without one for so long. Could he really let someone in now? Could he trust David? The questions gnawed at him, and he stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away from David. His mind was spinning, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He needed space. He needed time to think. David didn't stop him. He just watched, his expression unreadable, his hands still buried in his pockets. Jamal's footsteps echoed in the quiet park, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't escape the feeling that everything was changing, that he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't control. As he walked back toward the bench, he saw something, a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the park. The silhouette was familiar, and Jamal's stomach tightened. It was Marcus. Marcus was one of the guys Jamal had known from the streets, a familiar face in a world that often felt like it was full of strangers. They had crossed paths countless times over the years, sharing food, stories, and the occasional drink. Marcus wasn't the kind of guy Jamal trusted with his life, but he was someone who understood the struggle. And right now, that was all Jamal could hold on to. "Jamal," Marcus called out, his voice low and cautious. "You okay, man?" Jamal didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain what was happening, didn't know how to put the whirlwind of emotions into words. Instead, he just nodded and walked toward him, his footsteps slow, his mind still racing. "Who's the guy?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked past Jamal to where David was standing. "He looking for trouble or what?" Jamal's stomach twisted. He didn't know how to explain this either. How could he tell Marcus that this man, the one standing there, might be his father? That he might have spent his whole life wondering about this man's existence, and now he was here, offering Jamal a chance to rewrite everything he had known? I don't know, Jamal said, his voice distant. He says he's my dad. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Your dad? The guy who left you and your mom to fend for yourselves? He shook his head, his tone bitter. That's a joke, right? Jamal felt the sting of Marcus's words, but he didn't argue. Marcus wasn't wrong. He had every reason to be angry, to be bitter about the father who had abandoned him. But the pain was too raw, and Jamal didn't have the energy to fight. I don't know what to think, Jamal admitted, his voice low. I don't know if I can trust him. Marcus snorted, shaking his head. Man, you've been surviving just fine without anyone. Why would you need him now? Jamal didn't have an answer. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't want anyone, that he didn't know how to open up to the idea of having a father. I don't know, he said again, his voice trailing off. But I don't know if I can just walk away from this either. Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression hard to read. Finally, he sighed. Look, man, you don't owe him anything. You don't owe anyone anything. You're your own person. You don't need to let some guy who wasn't there for you suddenly show up and tell you how to live your life. Jamal nodded, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. He had always told himself that he didn't need anyone, that he could make it on his own. But now, with David standing there, offering him something he had never had, a chance at a family, Jamal wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crack, and he didn't know if he was ready to let them fall. I don't know what to do, Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's right. Marcus didn't say anything else. He just patted Jamal on the back, his expression unreadable. Take your time, man. Just don't let him drag you into something you're not ready for. Jamal watched as Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. He was alone again, standing on the edge of a decision he wasn't ready to make. David was still waiting, still watching him from across the park. And Jamal knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, it would change everything. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that, but the choice was his. And he had to make it soon. Jamal stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at his skin, his mind swirling with the weight of the decisions ahead. His heart was heavy, torn between the life he had built alone and the possibility of something more. He had always been on his own, relying on himself, trusting only the few people who had shown him kindness. Marcus was right about one thing, he didn't owe anyone anything. But David wasn't just anyone. He was the man who, for better or worse, had brought him into this world. And that fact alone made Jamal feel something he hadn't expected, confusion, doubt, and a strange flicker of hope. He turned his gaze back toward David, who was still standing by the bench, watching him with a look of quiet patience. Jamal could see the uncertainty in his posture, the way he was holding himself back, waiting for Jamal to make the first move. It was a strange thing, seeing a grown man so vulnerable, and it made Jamal feel uneasy. Was this some kind of act? Or was David truly trying to make amends? Jamal's feet carried him back toward the bench, though every step felt heavier than the last. His thoughts raced, but his body felt like it was moving on autopilot. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront all the feelings that were bubbling up inside him. The anger, the hurt, the abandonment, how could he even begin to process it all? David's eyes met as Jamal sat down again, the silence between them stretching out like a vast, unspoken chasm. The older man's expression was filled with an odd mixture of hope and fear, as if he, too, was waiting for something to shift in the air. I didn't mean to make you feel like this is something you have to do, David said quietly, his voice rough. I want you to know that I'm here. I want to be here for you, Jamal. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope, over time, you'll see that I'm not the same person I was back then. Jamal's chest tightened, and he swallowed hard. The words sounded sincere, but Jamal had heard promises like this before. He had heard them from people who had left, people who had come and gone, each one offering something they never truly followed through on. How could he trust David when so many others had let him down? "I don't know what to say to you," Jamal admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forget everything. You weren't there when I needed you. You weren't there when Mom was sick. And now you want me to just accept you?" David looked down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of Jamal's words had struck him harder than he'd anticipated. I know I can't undo the past, Jamal. I can't take away the hurt or the anger you must feel. But I can try to make up for it now. I can't change what happened, but I can be here for you now. I can be the father I should have been all those years ago." Jamal stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He wanted to believe David, wanted to believe that this was more than just a desperate attempt to fill the void of a lost father. But the truth was, Jamal didn't know how to let anyone in. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, telling himself that he didn't need anyone. His mother had been his everything. And now, with her gone, he was left with nothing but this man who, for all intents and purposes, was a stranger. "I don't even know who you are," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. "You say you want to be here, but I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can just let you into my life like that." David's eyes filled with a deep sadness, but he didn't try to argue. He simply nodded, as if he understood the depth of Jamal's pain. "I know this is hard. I know I've given you no reason to trust me. But I'm asking for a chance. Not for me, but for you. You deserve to know who I am. You deserve to have the truth, Jamal. And I'll give you all the time you need." Jamal felt a knot in his stomach tighten. The sincerity in David's voice was almost too much to bear. But the more Jamal thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about David. This was about Jamal, about who he was, what he wanted, and whether he could face the possibility of a future with someone who had been absent for so long. Could he truly allow himself to trust again? Could he risk the pain of disappointment, of abandonment, all over again? The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the quiet of the park wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Jamal's thoughts wandered back to his mother. She had always been the one person who had given him everything. She had worked hard to give him a life, even if it hadn't been perfect. But now, with her gone, Jamal was left to confront the reality of what was missing. Was it too late for him to have a father? Could he really let David in, after all this time? A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and Jamal shivered, pulling his hoodie tighter around his shoulders. The chill in the air seemed to mirror the coldness that had settled in his chest. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what the right choice was. David, sensing the tension in the air, stood up slowly. "I'm not going anywhere, Jamal. I'll be here when you're ready. But I want you to know that I'm serious. I want to be a part of your life." Jamal watched as David took a few steps back, his figure slowly fading into the shadows. The words hung in the air, unresolved, unanswered. Jamal's mind raced, the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, with no clear path ahead. As the park grew quieter, Jamal remained seated on the bench, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever forgive David for the past. But one thing was certain, whatever decision he made, it would change everything. The question was he ready for that change? The days that followed felt like they were dragging on forever. Jamal couldn't stop thinking about David, couldn't stop replaying their conversation over and over in his head. The park, the bench, David's eyes full of hope, everything had been so overwhelming, so confusing. He had told himself he wasn't going to think about it, that he would move on, focus on surviving like he always had. But the truth was, he couldn't escape it. The idea of having a father, someone who actually wanted to be a part of his life, gnawed at him constantly. It felt like a dream he didn't know if he could trust. Every time Jamal walked through the streets, his eyes would wander to the faces of strangers, wondering if any of them were like David. Wondering if any of them could be his family, his blood. He'd spent so many years alone, so many years with only his mother's love to keep him going. The thought of someone else, someone new, coming into his life felt like a betrayal to her memory. She had been everything to him, and now, to even consider letting someone else in felt like he was dishonoring her. But the more Jamal tried to shut it out, the more the questions crept in. What if David was telling the truth? What if he really had changed? What if, for once, Jamal could have the family he had always dreamed of? The possibilities haunted him, but so did the fear of being hurt again. He had already been abandoned once. Could he really risk it again? The weight of the decision began to feel unbearable. Jamal found himself retreating into the familiar, back to the streets, back to the places where he didn't have to think about his past or his future. But even there, he couldn't escape the pull of the question, what if? It wasn't until a week later, on a cold, foggy evening, that Jamal's resolve finally cracked. He was walking home from a corner store when he saw him again. David. He was standing by a lamppost, looking just as he had that night in the park, patient, waiting, but now there was a sense of urgency in his stance. It was like he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jamal to come to him. Jamal's heart skipped a beat, his feet freezing in place. He had been avoiding this moment, pushing it to the back of his mind, but now it was here. The decision was staring him in the face. There was no running anymore. He could walk away, pretend this never happened, or he could take the leap. The leap into the unknown. For a long moment, Jamal stood there, unsure of what to do. His body felt heavy, as though the weight of his past was holding him back. But then, something inside him shifted. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it all melted away, replaced by something else. A small spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be something good. Something worth fighting for. With a deep breath, Jamal stepped forward, his footsteps slow but steady. As he approached David, he saw the way the older man's face lit up, a flicker of relief crossing his features. David opened his mouth to speak, but Jamal held up a hand, silencing him. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Jamal said, his voice low, but steady. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give you a chance. David's eyes softened, and for a moment, it looked like he might cry. He took a step forward, his hands trembling as he reached out. Jamal, you don't know how much this means to me. I don't know how to make up for lost time, but I'm going to try. I swear I will. Jamal nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know if this was the right decision, but he knew it was the only one he could make. He couldn't keep running from the possibility of something more. He couldn't keep shutting people out, not when there was a chance, however small, that this could be the family he had always dreamed of. But as Jamal stood there, facing David, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. There was something in David's eyes, something in the way he was holding himself, that made Jamal pause. Was this really his father? Or was this just another person trying to manipulate him, trying to get something from him? He wanted to believe David. He really did. But there was a part of him that was still unsure, still afraid of being let down. I don't know what this is going to look like, Jamal said, his voice trembling. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes. But I need you to know something, David. I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. I need to know who I am. And if you're really my father, I need to know that you're not going to disappear again. David's expression turned serious, his eyes searching Jamal's face. I promise, Jamal. I won't leave you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But even as David spoke, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The words sounded too rehearsed, too perfect. The nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach grew stronger, and Jamal had to fight the urge to step back, to pull away. Before he could say anything more, a voice interrupted them. A voice that Jamal knew all too well. David? Both Jamal and David turned at the same time, their heads snapping toward the source of the voice. Standing in the shadows of the alleyway was another figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. It was a man Jamal had never seen before, but there was something about him that felt familiar. Something about his face, his eyes, struck a chord deep within Jamal. The man stepped forward, his gaze locked on David, and then he looked at Jamal. His eyes widened in recognition, and Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. "I didn't expect to find you here," the man said, his voice low, filled with an unsettling calm. "But I guess it was only a matter of time." Jamal's heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Who was this man? And why did he look at David with such intensity? What was going on? David's face went pale, and for the first time, Jamal saw a crack in his calm demeanor. "What are you doing here?" David asked, his voice strained. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated, and full of something Jamal couldn't quite place. "I think we need to talk, David. And I think your son deserves to hear this too." Jamal's mind spun as he looked back and forth between the two men. What was happening? What was this stranger talking about? And why did it feel like everything he thought he knew about his past was about to unravel before his eyes? The tension was unbearable, and Jamal felt his pulse quicken as the man took another step forward, his eyes never leaving David. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Jamal knew, in that moment, that the truth, whatever it was about to come crashing down. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, as Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The stranger's presence felt like a storm on the horizon, and Jamal could sense that the quiet, uneasy calm between him and David was about to shatter. David's face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, guilt, maybe. Jamal couldn't tell. The older man took a step back, almost as if he was trying to retreat, but the stranger didn't let him. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving David, and Jamal could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity in the air. "Who are you?" Jamal finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt tight, his chest constricted. This wasn't what he had expected. He had come here hoping to find answers, hoping for some kind of resolution, but now, with this man standing before them, everything felt more uncertain than ever. The stranger's eyes flickered toward Jamal, and for a moment, there was a strange recognition in his gaze. He studied Jamal as if weighing something in his mind, then turned back to David. "Isn't it time you told him the truth?" the man said, his voice cold, almost mocking. "Or do you think you can keep running from your past forever?" David's jaw clenched, and Jamal saw his fists tighten at his sides. It was the first time he had seen David so visibly rattled. For a brief moment, Jamal wondered if he had made a mistake, if this was some kind of trap, some game being played at his expense. But the stranger's presence was too unsettling, too loaded with something Jamal couldn't quite understand. David took a deep breath, his eyes darting between the man and Jamal. "Jamal, I didn't want you to find out like this," David said, his voice strained. "I didn't want to burden you with this, not after everything we've been through." The stranger scoffed. "Burden him? You think you're sparing him by keeping him in the dark? You're only making things worse, David. You know that." Jamal felt his chest tighten. The words didn't make sense. What was David hiding? What was the truth he was so desperate to protect? "Enough with the games," Jamal snapped, his voice rising. "What's going on? Who is this guy, and what does he want with you?" The stranger's eyes flickered with something like amusement, but there was no warmth in his expression. "I'm someone from David's past. Someone he'd rather forget. But I think it's time Jamal knows the truth. Don't you, David?" David's face hardened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but then he hesitated. Jamal could see the struggle on his face, the way his lips pressed together as if he was trying to find the right words, or maybe, trying to decide whether he could even speak them. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and heavy with regret. "This isn't easy, Jamal. There's something you don't know. Something I've kept from you all these years." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" he demanded. "What are you hiding?" David looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain, before he finally said the words that made Jamal's stomach drop. "Jamal, this man, he's not just someone from my past. He's your uncle." Jamal's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if the very foundation of his life had just been ripped out from under him. His mind couldn't process the words. His uncle? How could this man be his uncle? He had never heard anything about an uncle. His mother had never mentioned anyone, never spoken of family beyond the two of them. For a moment, Jamal could only stare at the stranger, his mouth dry, his heart racing. The man was his uncle? How could that be? He had no memory of anyone like him. He had no idea that David had a brother, or anyone else in his family, for that matter. The stranger seemed to enjoy the shock on Jamal's face, his lips curling into a smirk. "It's true, kid. I'm your uncle. And I've been trying to get David to face the truth for years. But he's been running from it. Running from you." Jamal's mind spun, his thoughts in a tangled mess. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was simple, but the answer felt so complicated. Why had David kept this from him? Why had his mother never mentioned her brother? David's face twisted with guilt. "I never wanted you to get caught up in all this," he said quietly. "There's a lot I've done, a lot I've regretted. And I didn't want you to carry that weight. I wanted you to have a chance at something better. I thought if I kept you away from my past, you could have a fresh start." The stranger scoffed. "Fresh start? You're just making excuses, David. You've been running from your past, from the mistakes you made, and now it's catching up with you. It's catching up with both of you." Jamal's mind was reeling. His uncle? His mother's brother? He couldn't even wrap his head around it. And David, his father, had been hiding this from him all this time. What else had he been hiding? What else had he kept from Jamal? "I don't understand," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Mom ever talk about him?" David looked away, his eyes clouded with shame. "Your mother and I, we had our issues. A lot of things happened between us. But I thought you were better off without knowing. I thought you'd be safer." Jamal's head was spinning, and he took a step back, as if distancing himself from both of them. He couldn't handle this, not now. His whole life had just been turned upside down, and he wasn't sure he could trust anyone anymore. Not David. Not this man. Not anyone. The stranger's voice cut through the silence. "You're not the only one with a past, kid. And neither is David. We've all got skeletons in our closets. But now it's time for the truth to come out. And you deserve to know everything." Jamal's breath quickened, his mind racing, but he didn't know what to think anymore. What was the truth? What had David been hiding all these years? And how much of it was tied to this man standing before him? He had come here looking for answers, but now, all he had were more questions, more uncertainty, more fear. And as the fog rolled in around them, Jamal knew that whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. Jamal's heart was pounding in his chest, the words from both David and his so-called uncle echoing in his ears. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He had come here, hoping for answers, hoping for some kind of closure, but now it felt like everything was slipping out of his grasp. The truth was unraveling, but it was more tangled than he could have ever imagined. As the man, his uncle, stood there, a smug expression playing across his face, Jamal's instincts told him something was off. There was something in the stranger's demeanor, something in the way he spoke, that didn't sit right with Jamal. It wasn't just the revelation of family secrets or the betrayal from David that had shaken him. It was the way this man seemed to relish the chaos, the way he enjoyed watching Jamal struggle with the weight of the truth. David, still looking pale and shaken, took a step forward, his eyes pleading. "Jamal, please, just listen to me. It's not what you think." But Jamal was done listening. He had heard enough. He turned away from both of them, his mind racing, his thoughts a blur. He needed to get out of there, to breathe, to think. But before he could take another step, a voice stopped him in his tracks. This time, it wasn't David's or his uncle's. "Jamal, wait." The voice was familiar, but Jamal couldn't place it. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Standing just behind the man who claimed to be his uncle was another figure, someone he had never expected to see. It was a woman, young, with dark eyes and a look of intense determination on her face. She stepped forward, her gaze locking with Jamal's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice urgent. "It's important." Jamal's mind reeled. Who was this woman? Why was she here? And why did it feel like she was about to drop another bombshell on his already shattered world? David and his uncle both looked at her, their expressions tightening. Jamal could feel the tension rise again, thick and suffocating, like a storm building just on the horizon. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Jamal's. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she continued, her voice softer now, but still carrying a sense of urgency. "But you need to know something about your mother." Jamal's chest tightened at the mention of his mother. His mind raced. What more could there possibly be? Hadn't his entire life been defined by the secrets surrounding her? Hadn't David and this man already revealed enough to tear apart everything he thought he knew? The woman seemed to sense Jamal's shock, and she gave him a moment to process. "I know this is hard to hear," she said, "but I'm not just some stranger. I'm your sister." Jamal's world seemed to stop. His legs felt like they might give way beneath him. His sister? He had no sister. He had never heard of anyone like her. His mother had never mentioned a daughter, never hinted at any family beyond the two of them. Jamal felt the ground beneath him shift, like the earth was crumbling away at his feet. The woman's words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Jamal couldn't move, couldn't speak. He looked from her to David, to his uncle, trying to make sense of it all. But nothing made sense anymore. It was as if his entire life had been built on a lie, a carefully constructed facade that was now falling apart piece by piece. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want you to find out like this. But it's time you knew the truth. Your mother wasn't just hiding you from your father. She was hiding you from me." Jamal's mind was spinning, his heart racing. He couldn't process what she was saying. His mother had kept secrets from him, but this was too much. His sister? How could that even be possible? And why had no one told him? Why had David and his uncle kept this from him? David stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "Jamal, please, listen to her. This is the truth. She's your sister, and we've all been trying to protect you from a past that's too dangerous to face." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with pain. "Your mother and I, we didn't have the kind of relationship you think. There's a lot more to our family than you know, Jamal. And it's time you understood why she kept you away from all of this." Jamal's mind was reeling. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of questions, each one more impossible than the last. His mother had kept him in the dark about his family, about his past, about everything. And now, this woman, this stranger, was claiming to be his sister, telling him that his mother had been hiding him from her all these years. "I don't understand," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would she do that? Why would she keep me from you? From all of you?" The woman's face darkened, and for the first time, Jamal saw something dangerous in her eyes. "Because our family isn't what you think. It's not just about love and forgiveness. It's about power, control, and survival. Your mother, she made a choice. And now, we all have to live with the consequences." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with meaning that Jamal couldn't quite grasp. What was she talking about? What kind of family was he a part of? Why had his mother kept him away from all of this? And why was it so dangerous now? Jamal felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The truth was slipping through his fingers, just out of reach, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know any more. But he had to. He had to understand. He had to know why his mother had kept him in the dark. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Jamal said, his voice breaking. "I don't know who to trust." David stepped forward, his expression pleading. "Jamal, I swear to you, everything I've done has been to protect you. To keep you safe." But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the truth became. His past, his family, everything he thought he knew, it was all slipping away, replaced by something darker, more complicated. And as the fog thickened around them, Jamal realized that the answers he sought might not bring the peace he was hoping for. They might just lead him deeper into a world he wasn't prepared for, a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. As the tension mounted, Jamal felt the cold chill of uncertainty settle in his bones. The truth was just out of reach, and the closer he got to it, the more dangerous it became. What would happen if he uncovered it all? What would it mean for him, for his future? And would he be able to survive the storm that was about to hit? The stakes had never been higher, and Jamal knew that whatever came next, it would change everything. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest as he processed the latest revelation. His sister. How could this woman be his sister? And why was everything surrounding his family so tangled in secrets and lies? The air around him seemed to grow colder, the tension thick enough to choke him. The words danger and survival echoed in his mind, and he could feel the weight of them pressing on him, suffocating him. He turned to David, hoping for some kind of explanation, something that would make sense of this nightmare. But David's face was pale, his lips pressed tight in a grim line. It was clear that whatever Jamal was hearing now was something David had known for far too long. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "David," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me about her? About all of this?" David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He closed his eyes, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. Jamal could see the struggle in his face, the guilt, the regret. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. The woman, his sister, stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Jamal's. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said softly, "but you need to understand that your mother did what she thought was best. She thought she was protecting you from a past that would only hurt you." Jamal shook his head, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "Protecting me from what? What could be so bad that she had to keep me away from all of you? From the truth?" She hesitated, glancing at David and the man who had called himself his uncle. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and Jamal could feel it, too, the sense that there was more to this story, something even darker than he could imagine. The silence stretched longer, and just as Jamal was about to demand more answers, the woman spoke again. "Because your father, he's not who you think he is. And neither is David." Jamal froze, his blood running cold. His father? What did she mean by that? He had always known his father as the man who had abandoned him and his mother, the man who had disappeared from his life without a trace. But now, it seemed like the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. "What do you mean?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean my father's not who I think he is?" The woman took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for the storm she was about to unleash. "Your father, he's not just a man who left. He's a man who was involved in something far bigger than you could ever imagine. And David, he's been hiding the truth from you, too. The truth about your family's past, about the things that went wrong." Jamal's mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. His father wasn't just some deadbeat who had walked out of his life, he was involved in something bigger. And David, the man who had raised him, had been hiding all of this from him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they didn't make any sense. They only raised more questions. David's face was contorted with guilt, his eyes filled with regret. "Jamal, I never wanted you to be part of this. I never wanted you to be dragged into the mess that your father left behind. I thought if I kept you away from all of it, you'd have a chance at something better." But Jamal wasn't listening anymore. The anger and confusion were rising in him, the flood of emotions threatening to break free. "So all this time, you've been lying to me?" he asked, his voice shaking with fury. "You've been keeping me in the dark about who I really am, about my own family?" David opened his mouth, but Jamal wasn't waiting for excuses anymore. His world had already shattered, and he didn't know how much more he could take. "Jamal, please," David said, his voice strained. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you. But the truth is, your father's not just anyone. He's someone dangerous. And so are the people who've been looking for you." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. Dangerous? People looking for him? What was David talking about? His father was supposed to be a man who had left him behind, not someone involved in some shadowy world of danger and secrets. "I don't understand," Jamal said, his voice breaking. "What do you mean? Who's looking for me?" The stranger, his uncle, finally spoke, his voice low and filled with a dark undertone. "You think this is all coincidence? That everything happening right now is just some random event? No, kid. Your family has a history. And people from your father's past have been searching for you. They've been waiting for the right moment to find you. And now, that moment's here." Jamal's head spun. He couldn't process the words. His father's past. People searching for him? He had no idea what this man was talking about. But he could see the fear in David's eyes, the way his uncle's expression remained cold and distant, as if he was trying to distance himself from the danger that was closing in around them. The woman, the sister he never knew he had, looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. "Jamal, you need to listen to me. You're not just a victim in all of this. You're part of something bigger. And if you don't understand that now, you will soon enough." Jamal's mind was reeling. His world was spinning out of control, and the more he tried to make sense of it, the more it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. His family was a web of lies, betrayal, and danger, and he had no idea how deep it all went. "You don't have to do this alone," his sister said, her voice soft but insistent. "We can help you. But you have to trust us." Jamal looked at her, at David, at the man who claimed to be his uncle. But the trust he had once placed in them was gone, shattered beyond repair. They had all lied to him. They had kept him in the dark for his entire life, and now they were asking him to trust them again. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Jamal said, his voice hoarse. "Everything I thought I knew is a lie." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Jamal didn't know where to go from here, didn't know who he could turn to. But one thing was clear, the truth was dangerous, and the stakes had never been higher. As the tension in the room grew, Jamal knew that whatever came next, it would push him to his limits. And there was no turning back now. The storm was coming, and he had no idea how he would survive it. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating almost, as Jamal stood there, trying to process the chaos that was his life now. His sister, who he never knew existed, was standing in front of him, pleading with him to trust her. David, the man who had raised him, was still desperately trying to explain, but Jamal could feel the distance between them growing. His whole world was unraveling, and the more he learned, the less he understood. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and fear. The words his sister had spoken kept repeating in his mind, "People from your father's past have been searching for you." Jamal didn't know what to believe anymore. He had always been told that his father was just some deadbeat who had walked away from their family. But now, it seemed like there was so much more to the story, a story that was darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "Jamal, please," David said again, his voice pleading. "I know this is hard, but you need to understand, your father's past is dangerous. It's not something we can just ignore. It's a part of who you are now, whether you like it or not." Jamal looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "So, what? You think I should just accept all of this? That I should just trust you after everything you've kept from me?" David's face faltered, and for a brief moment, Jamal saw the regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the years of lies, the secrets that had been kept from him, the betrayal that had been simmering under the surface all along. His sister stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. "Jamal, I know it's hard. But I'm telling you the truth. Our father, he wasn't just some man who disappeared. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And you," she paused, as if trying to find the right words. "You've been marked. They've been looking for you." Jamal recoiled at the words. "Marked? Who's looking for me? Why?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking between David and the man who had introduced himself as his uncle. The tension in the room thickened. Jamal could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on him. The truth was just out of reach, and it was like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But what he could sense, what he could feel deep in his gut, was that something dangerous was coming. Something that would change everything. David spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "Jamal, we've been trying to protect you. We've been trying to keep you safe from the people who've been searching for you. Your father's enemies, they're still out there. And they'll stop at nothing to get to you." Jamal's mind was spinning. Enemies? What enemies? His father had disappeared, and he had always assumed that was the end of it. But now it seemed like there was so much more to the story, a whole world of danger and intrigue that he had never been part of. And the more he learned, the more it felt like his life was spiraling out of control. "I don't know what you want from me," Jamal said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what any of this means. You're telling me my father's enemies are after me? Why? What do they want with me?" His sister stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. "They want you because you're the key to something they've been after for years. Your father was involved in things that go beyond what you can imagine. And now, they think you know something. They think you have something that can help them." Jamal shook his head, the weight of her words crashing down on him. His father was a mystery to him, a man who had abandoned him and his mother. But now, he was learning that his father's disappearance wasn't just some casual choice. It had been a part of something bigger, something that Jamal couldn't even begin to understand. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Jamal asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why keep it from me? Why keep me in the dark about all of this?" David lowered his gaze, unable to meet Jamal's eyes. "We were trying to protect you. But now it's too late. The people who are looking for you are getting closer. We can't keep you safe anymore, not unless you understand what's at stake." The words hung in the air, and Jamal felt the weight of them settle in his chest. He had always known that his life wasn't normal, that something had been missing, but he had never imagined it was like this. His family, his mother, David, even this woman who claimed to be his sister, had all been hiding things from him. And now, the truth was spilling out, but it was too much, too fast. He turned to his sister, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "So, what now? You want me to just join you in this mess? You want me to help you fight these people who are after me?" She nodded, her expression serious. "You don't have a choice, Jamal. They'll come for you whether you're ready or not. The only choice you have is whether you want to face them with us or face them alone." Jamal felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't want to be part of this world. He didn't want to be dragged into whatever dangerous web his father had left behind. But the more he heard, the more it seemed like there was no escaping it. The people who were after him weren't just going to go away. They were coming, and they were coming fast. David stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "Jamal, you have to trust us. We can help you. But you need to understand what you're up against. Your father's past is more than just a family secret. It's a threat to your life. And if we don't act now, it'll be too late." Jamal's heart raced. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, and he still couldn't wrap his head around it. His father's past, his family's secrets, the enemies that were hunting him, everything was spinning out of control. He didn't know who to trust, didn't know what to believe. But one thing was certain, the storm was coming, and there was no way to stop it. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Jamal's thoughts raced. His mind was a blur of questions, of fears, of anger. What was he supposed to do now? Could he trust these people, his family, who had kept him in the dark for so long? Or was he just another pawn in a dangerous game he didn't understand? The answers were just out of reach, and Jamal knew that whatever came next, it would change everything. The silence in the room was deafening. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the faces of the people around him, David, his sister, and the man who had claimed to be his uncle. Every word they had spoken, every piece of information they had given him, felt like a weight pressing down on him. But now, as the tension reached its peak, something inside him snapped. He couldn't keep running from the truth anymore. He had to face it, no matter how painful or dangerous it was. "I don't know if I can trust you," Jamal said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can trust any of you anymore." David stepped forward, his face filled with urgency. "Jamal, please. You have to understand. This is bigger than anything we've told you. Your father's enemies." "I don't care about my father's enemies," Jamal interrupted, his voice rising. "I care about my life. And I want to know the truth. All of it. No more lies." The room fell into a heavy silence. Jamal's sister exchanged a look with David, and for a moment, it seemed like they were deciding whether to tell him the full story. Finally, his sister spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The truth is, your father didn't just disappear," she said. "He didn't leave us because he wanted to. He was forced to. There's something about you, Jamal. Something they want." Jamal's mind raced. Something about him? What could he possibly have that would make people hunt him down like this? His father's past, his family's secrets, it was all too much to take in. But the more he heard, the more he realized that his life had never been normal. It had never been a simple story of abandonment or loss. It was a story of power, of danger, and of survival. "You're the key," his sister continued. "Your father's enemies believe that you have something they need. And that's why they've been looking for you. They think you know where it is." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "Where what is? What are you talking about?" David stepped in, his face grim. "The artifact. Your father was involved in a secret operation. He was working with people who wanted to control something powerful, something that could change the world. And now, they think you know where it is." Jamal's mind reeled. An artifact? What kind of power could an object hold that would make people willing to kill for it? And why would they think he, a teenager with no idea about his father's past, could possibly know anything about it? "They've been hunting you for years, Jamal," David said. "They think you're the key to finding it. But they don't know you've been kept in the dark. They don't know that you don't have the answers." Jamal felt his knees weaken. He had always felt like an outsider, like something was missing in his life. But now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. His father wasn't just a man who had walked away. He had been part of something dangerous, something that had put Jamal in the crosshairs of people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "We need to get you out of here," his sister said urgently. "They're coming. We don't have much time." Jamal nodded, his mind still reeling from the revelation. But before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. David's eyes widened in panic. "They're here," he said, his voice low and filled with fear. "We don't have much time. We need to move, now." Jamal's heart raced as he followed David and his sister through the house, the urgency in their movements almost too much to process. The weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. They reached the back door, and David swung it open, revealing the darkened alley behind the house. But before they could step outside, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jamal froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a man, tall, imposing, with cold eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "Going somewhere," the man said, his voice low and menacing. David stepped in front of Jamal, his body tense. "Get out of our way," he said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of fear. The man didn't move. "I don't think you understand, David," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "This is bigger than you. You've been hiding him for too long. It's time to bring him in." Jamal's mind raced. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The moment everything came crashing down. Suddenly, his sister stepped forward, her eyes filled with determination. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice sharp. "He's not going anywhere with you. Not now. Not ever." The man's expression hardened, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. David's eyes flickered toward the street, his face filled with a mix of relief and dread. "They're here," he muttered. "We need to move, now." But before they could react, the man stepped forward, pulling out a gun from under his jacket. Jamal's heart stopped. This was it. He was going to die, just like his father had. But then, in an instant, his sister lunged at the man, knocking the gun from his hand. The two struggled on the ground, and Jamal's mind spun in disbelief. This was his sister, the woman he had just met, and she was fighting for his life. David grabbed Jamal's arm and pulled him toward the alley. "Run," he shouted. "Now." Jamal didn't hesitate. He ran as fast as he could, the sound of footsteps and shouting echoing behind him. His sister's voice rang in his ears, urging him to keep going. He didn't know where they were going, didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing, his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. As they rounded the corner, Jamal's thoughts raced. The truth had been revealed, but it had only led to more questions, more danger. His father's enemies were after him, and he had no idea what they wanted. But whatever it was something that could change everything. And now, with his life on the line, Jamal had no choice but to fight for survival. But just as they reached the street, a car screeched to a halt in front of them. The door swung open, and a figure stepped out, someone Jamal had never expected to see again. His father. "Get in the car," his father said, his voice urgent. "We don't have much time." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Everything he thought he knew had just been turned upside down. His father was alive. And he was about to find out just how deep the lies went. The car door slammed shut behind them, and as they sped off into the night, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The car sped through the streets, the tires screeching as they cut through the night. Jamal's mind was spinning, unable to process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. His father, alive, standing in front of him, was a reality he couldn't fully grasp. He had spent years believing his father was a ghost, a distant memory, a man who had abandoned him and his mother. But now, here he was, sitting in the back of a car, facing the man who had left him behind for reasons he still didn't understand. Jamal's father, a man he had only known through fragmented stories and angry conversations from his mother, was now looking at him with an intensity that made Jamal's skin crawl. His father's face was older, worn by time and experience, but there was no mistaking the familiarity in his eyes. They were the same eyes Jamal had seen in the mirror every day of his life. "We don't have much time," his father said, his voice sharp, as if every second counted. "They'll be after us soon. I don't know how much David has told you, but you need to listen to me, Jamal. Everything you've been told up until now is a lie. Your life is in danger, and there's no running from it." Jamal's heart raced. The man who had left him, the man who had abandoned his family, was now telling him that his life was at risk. It didn't make sense. But the urgency in his father's voice was undeniable. Jamal felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, everything is a lie?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "You left us. You left me and my mom, and now you're telling me that I'm in danger because of some artifact, some secret you were involved in? What is this, Dad? What are you dragging me into?" His father's expression softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "I never wanted this for you, Jamal. I didn't want you to get caught up in this world. But you're part of it now, whether you like it or not. The people who've been hunting you, they don't care about you. They care about what you have, what you know. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. Jamal felt his chest tighten. The weight of his father's words was suffocating, and the fear that had been building inside him was now a full-blown panic. What could he possibly have that was so important? What was this artifact, and why were people willing to kill for it? Who are they? Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. Who's after me? His father's face hardened again, and he glanced at the rearview mirror, as if checking for anyone tailing them. I can't tell you everything right now. But what I can tell you is that you're not just my son. You're the key to something much bigger. The artifact they're after, it's a powerful piece of history. It's not just any object. It's something that could change the world. And they think you know where it is. Jamal's head was spinning. The words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. An artifact? A piece of history? He was just a teenager. He didn't know anything about ancient artifacts or dangerous people. All he knew was that his life had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours, and now his father was telling him that he was the center of some twisted, dangerous game. What do you mean, I'm the key? I don't know anything about any artifact, Jamal said, his voice rising in frustration. I don't even know who these people are. Why me? His father's eyes flicked to him, a mixture of regret and determination in his gaze. Because they think you do. They think you know where it is, even if you don't. You've been marked, Jamal. Ever since you were born, you've been part of this. Your mother knew it. David knew it. And I've been trying to protect you from it. But it's too late now. They're already coming. Jamal's mind raced. He had always known there was something different about his family, something hidden beneath the surface. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He was part of something much bigger than he had ever realized. His father, the man he had thought of as a distant memory, was now telling him that his very existence was tied to a dangerous secret. The car turned sharply, and Jamal's father slammed his foot on the gas. The headlights of another car appeared in the distance, and Jamal's father's grip tightened on the wheel. They're here, his father said, his voice cold with determination. Hold on. Before Jamal could react, the car swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision with a black SUV that had appeared out of nowhere. The SUV quickly swerved to follow them, and Jamal's father sped through the streets, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of the pursuing vehicle. We need to get to the safe house, his father said, his voice tense. It's the only place we'll be safe for now. Jamal's heart was pounding in his chest as the car weaved through the streets, the sound of tires screeching filling the air. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew one thing for sure, his life had just become a high-speed chase. The danger was real, and there was no escaping it. The SUV behind them was relentless, its headlights blinding as it closed the gap between them. Jamal's father took a sharp turn, but the SUV was right behind them, matching their every move. Jamal's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The artifact, his father's enemies, the secrets that had been kept from him, everything was coming to a head, and he had no idea how it would end. Suddenly, the car lurched forward, and Jamal felt the jolt of the impact. The SUV had rammed them from behind, sending them spinning out of control. The world around him blurred as the car careened off the road and crashed into a nearby building. The sound of metal screeching and glass shattering filled the air, and for a moment, everything went black. When Jamal regained consciousness, he was disoriented, his head throbbing with pain. He blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog in his mind. His father was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, blood trickling down his forehead. Jamal's heart raced as he tried to shake him awake. "Dad!" Jamal shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Dad, wake up!" His father stirred, groaning as he slowly regained consciousness. "Jamal," he whispered, his voice weak. "Get out of the car. Now." Jamal's mind was racing, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his father's arm and pulled him out of the wreckage. The cold night air hit him like a shock, and he stumbled, trying to keep his balance. The SUV was still following them, its headlights illuminating the darkened streets. As they staggered away from the wreckage, Jamal's father looked at him, his eyes filled with urgency. "Jamal, listen to me. They're not just after the artifact. They're after you. You're the key to everything. Don't trust anyone." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, and in that moment, he realized the truth. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jamal's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as he dragged his father away from the wrecked car. His mind was a whirlwind, every thought colliding with the next, and none of it made sense. The car crash, the men chasing them, the artifact, nothing fit together. His father's warning, though, rang in his ears like a relentless drumbeat. Don't trust anyone. The SUV behind them screeched to a halt, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea how much time they had before the men inside came after them, but he knew one thing: they couldn't stay here. Not for a second longer. "Dad, we need to go," Jamal urged, trying to steady his father, who was still groggy from the crash. Blood was still dripping from his forehead, and he seemed barely conscious. Jamal's fear intensified. His father wasn't in any condition to be running from anyone, let alone fighting off whoever was chasing them. "We can't stay here," Jamal said again, his voice trembling. He glanced over his shoulder. The SUV's doors swung open, and two men in dark suits stepped out, their faces grim and determined. They were closing in. Jamal felt a surge of panic. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't prepared for this. He couldn't protect his father. His father, however, seemed to snap out of his daze. "Get to the alley," he rasped, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Move!" Without thinking, Jamal grabbed his father's arm again and half-dragged him toward the alleyway. The cold air cut through him, but there was no time to think about anything other than getting away. His mind raced with his father's words. "You're the key to everything." The more Jamal tried to understand it, the more questions piled up, and the more dangerous the situation became. They reached the alley, but the sound of footsteps behind them was unmistakable. The men were getting closer. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear his father's labored breathing, and he knew they didn't have much time. He had to do something. Anything. He pulled his father into a narrow space between two dumpsters, trying to shield them from view. His father's hand gripped his arm tightly, his face pale, but his eyes were clear now, focused. "Jamal," his father said, his voice low but firm, "you have to understand. They won't stop. Not until they have you. Until they have the artifact." Jamal shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about an artifact. Why are they after me? What's so important about me?" His father's eyes softened, but there was still a heavy weight in his gaze. "They think you know where it is. They think you can lead them to it. But you don't know anything, do you?" Jamal's chest tightened. "No. I don't know anything. I swear." His father nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer. "Good. That's good. You're not involved yet. But if they think you know where it is, they'll do anything to make you tell them. And you'll have to fight, Jamal. You'll have to fight for your life." Jamal's head was spinning. He was just a kid. He didn't want any part of this, didn't want to be dragged into some dangerous world of secrets and artifacts and people willing to kill for power. But as the footsteps drew nearer, he realized that there was no running. No escaping. This was his reality now. "We need to move," his father urged, pulling him from his thoughts. "They're getting closer." Jamal nodded, his mind still reeling, but he followed his father's lead as they moved deeper into the alley. The cold, damp air felt suffocating, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The distant sound of sirens added to the chaos, but Jamal knew they couldn't rely on the police to save them. Not now. Not when they were being hunted by people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The men were here. Go, his father shouted, pushing Jamal ahead. Now. They sprinted down the alley, the sound of footsteps and voices growing louder. Jamal's breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop. He had no choice. As they rounded a corner, they saw a black van parked at the end of the alley. The doors were wide open, and Jamal's father didn't hesitate. He shoved Jamal toward the van. Get in, he ordered, his voice urgent. Jamal hesitated for only a second before he climbed into the van. His father followed quickly, slamming the door behind him just as a dark figure appeared at the mouth of the alley. The van's engine roared to life, and they sped off, the tires screeching as they tore through the streets. Jamal's heart was still pounding, but he couldn't bring himself to relax. Not yet. His father was alive, but the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the van sped through the city, Jamal's father turned to him, his face serious. We need to get to the safe house. It's the only place we'll be safe for now. Jamal nodded, still trying to process everything. But before he could speak, his father's phone rang. He answered it quickly, his expression tightening as he listened. They're not far behind, his father said, hanging up the phone. We're not going to make it to the safe house in time. Jamal's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means we need to go off the grid, his father said, his voice low and urgent. We need to disappear. And we need to do it fast. Jamal's mind raced. He had no idea what his father was talking about. Off the grid? Disappear? What did that even mean? But one thing was clear, the people after them weren't just looking for an artifact. They were looking for him. And if his father was right, Jamal was the key to something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. As the van turned onto a dark, deserted road, Jamal's father looked at him, his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and resolve. I've kept you safe this long, Jamal, he said. But now, you're going to have to make a choice. You can't go back to the life you knew. Not anymore. You're in this now. And you have to decide, fight or run. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. The gravity of his father's words hit him like a ton of bricks. His life was no longer his own. He was caught in a game of power, of survival, and he didn't know how it would end. But one thing was certain, he was no longer the same person he had been just a few hours ago. The truth had been revealed, and now there was no turning back. And just as the van turned another corner, Jamal felt a deep sense of foreboding. This was just the beginning. The van continued to speed down the dark road, the engine's roar filling the tense silence. Jamal's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He had been thrust into a world he didn't understand, a world where every move felt like it could be his last. His father, the man he had thought was lost to him forever, was now his only guide in this strange, dangerous reality. But even his father seemed like a mystery, a man whose past was tangled with secrets and lies. As the van swerved around another sharp turn, Jamal's father glanced over at him. Listen, Jamal, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. There's a lot you don't know, but you'll learn. I'll teach you. We'll get through this together. Jamal nodded, though he wasn't sure if he could believe it. How could he trust a man who had disappeared from his life without a word? But there was something in his father's eyes, a flicker of sincerity, perhaps, that made Jamal hold on to the faintest hope. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. The road ahead was unfamiliar, the trees on either side casting long shadows under the moonlight. Jamal could feel the weight of his father's words, the pressure building inside him. He was caught between two worlds now, the world he had known, and the world his father was pulling him into. And no matter how much he wanted to turn back, to return to the life he had before all of this, he knew it wasn't possible. Not anymore. His father's phone rang again, breaking the silence. This time, his father answered quickly, his voice low and urgent. Jamal couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could tell by the way his father's expression changed that something was wrong. "We don't have much time," his father said, hanging up. "They're closing in. They know where we are." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Who knows where we are?" "They're not just after you anymore," his father replied, his voice grim. "They know everything. They're coming for both of us." Jamal swallowed hard. He had no idea what his father meant by "they know everything," but it didn't sound good. His father had been hiding something from him, something big, and now, it seemed like the past was finally catching up with them. The van turned onto a narrow dirt road, the trees closing in around them. Jamal's father didn't slow down, his eyes scanning the road ahead, always alert. They passed a small cabin tucked into the woods, and Jamal's father gave a quick nod toward it. "This is it," he said, pulling the van into a clearing. "We'll stay here for the night." Jamal didn't argue. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to think clearly. His father parked the van in front of the cabin, and they both climbed out. The air was cold, and the quiet of the woods felt almost suffocating. It was as if the world had stopped moving, holding its breath in anticipation of whatever was about to happen next. Inside the cabin, Jamal's father immediately went to a small desk in the corner and began rummaging through a drawer. He pulled out a small, weathered notebook and handed it to Jamal. "This," his father said, his voice low, "is what they've been after. This is the key." Jamal took the notebook, feeling its weight in his hands. It was old, the pages yellowed and fragile, but there was something about it that felt important. His father's gaze was intense as he watched Jamal's reaction. "You need to understand, Jamal," his father continued, "this isn't just about the artifact. This is about a power, something that's been hidden for centuries. They'll do anything to get it. They'll kill for it." Jamal stared at the notebook, his mind still trying to process everything. He had no idea what his father was talking about, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever was in that notebook, it was powerful. And dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jamal asked, his voice shaky with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" His father looked at him, his eyes filled with regret. "I wanted to protect you. I thought if you never knew about this, you'd be safe. But I was wrong. They've already found you. And now, it's too late." Jamal felt a deep, aching sadness in his chest. His father had kept so many secrets from him, and now it was all coming to a head. He didn't know if he could trust him, but he had no choice. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door, followed by the sound of footsteps outside. Jamal's heart raced. His father's eyes widened, and he grabbed Jamal's arm, pulling him toward the back of the cabin. "We need to move," his father said, his voice urgent. "Now." Jamal didn't question him. They ran out the back door, into the woods, the sound of the men outside growing louder. The cold air bit at Jamal's skin as they sprinted through the trees, the branches scratching at their faces. His mind was spinning, but all he could focus on was the sound of footsteps behind them, the feeling that they were being hunted. They reached a small clearing, and his father turned to face him. "Jamal, listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "You need to take the notebook. You need to get it out of here. If they find you with it, they'll kill you. Do you understand?" Jamal nodded, clutching the notebook to his chest. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let them take this from him. He couldn't let them take his life, his future. His father gave him one last, lingering look. "Go," he said. "Run." Jamal didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the earth, his heart racing in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. He had to survive. The night seemed endless, the darkness closing in around him. But as the hours passed, Jamal began to feel a strange sense of clarity. He had always wondered who he was, where he came from. But now, he realized that the answers weren't just in the past, they were in the choices he made now. He had the power to shape his future, to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. And as he ran through the woods, the notebook clutched tightly in his hands, Jamal made a promise to himself. He would find the truth. He would uncover the secrets his father had kept from him. And he would fight for his future, no matter the cost. The night was still, but Jamal knew the journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was ready. He had no choice but to face whatever came next. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jamal felt a sense of determination flood through him. The chase wasn't over. But he was no longer running away. He was running toward something, toward the truth, toward his destiny. The world had changed, and so had he. As Jamal ran through the woods, the chill of the early morning air biting at his skin, he could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The notebook, the secrets, his father's warnings, it was all too much for a teenager to bear. But in the midst of the chaos, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just running from danger anymore. He was running toward something. Toward the answers he had spent his entire life searching for. Toward the truth about who he was and why his father had kept him in the dark for so long. His feet pounded the ground, each step a mix of fear and determination. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. Every crack of a twig, every rustling of leaves behind him sent his heart into overdrive. The men chasing them were relentless, and Jamal knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He glanced back over his shoulder, his breath coming in quick bursts. He couldn't see anyone yet, but he knew they were out there. They were close. Too close. Suddenly, he stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the leaves. He hit the ground hard, the notebook slipping from his grasp. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to grab it, his fingers trembling as they closed around the worn edges. He couldn't afford to lose it. Not now. Not when everything depended on it. He pushed himself to his feet, breathing heavily, and took off again, faster this time. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around him, making it harder to see where he was going. But he didn't care. He had to keep moving. His father's words echoed in his mind, *, they'll kill you for it. *, Jamal didn't know what it was, he didn't understand what was so special about the notebook, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let them get their hands on it. As the sun began to rise, casting a faint glow over the horizon, Jamal's legs started to feel like lead. His body ached from the constant running, his muscles burning with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. No time to stop. He had to keep going. And then, just as the light grew brighter, a voice called out from behind him. Jamal. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice was familiar, but it took him a moment to place it. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the trees for the source of the sound. Dad, he called out, his voice shaky. There, emerging from the shadows of the trees, was his father. He was breathing heavily, his clothes torn and his face smeared with dirt and blood. But he was alive. He had made it. Jamal, you have to listen to me, his father said, his voice strained. They're not far behind. We don't have much time. Jamal's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and fear. He wanted to run to his father, to find comfort in his presence, but something stopped him. There was a new urgency in his father's voice, a sense of desperation that Jamal hadn't heard before. What's going on? Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are they after us? What's in the notebook? His father hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. The notebook, it's not just a map or a record of some ancient treasure, his father began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. It's a key. A key to something much bigger. Something that could change everything. Jamal's confusion deepened. Change everything? What are you talking about? His father stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Jamal's. There's a power hidden in that notebook, Jamal. A power that can alter the course of history. There are people, dangerous people, who will stop at nothing to get it. They'll use it to control everything. And they think you're the only one who can unlock it. Jamal's mind reeled. A power that could change history? He couldn't fathom it. He was just a kid, a homeless teenager who had stumbled into a situation he didn't understand. But his father's words had a weight to them, a truth that felt undeniable. I didn't want to pull you into this, his father continued, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I could protect you by keeping you away from it. But I was wrong. They found you. And now we have no choice but to face it. Jamal looked down at the notebook in his hands, its pages old and fragile, yet somehow still holding a sense of importance. He didn't know what was inside, but he knew it was something powerful. Something worth fighting for. What do we do now? Jamal asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. His father's expression hardened, a look of resolve settling on his face. We fight. We don't run anymore. We take control of this, Jamal. We stop them from using it for their own gain. We make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Jamal nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. They didn't have much time. The men who were after them were closing in, and Jamal could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But as he looked at his father, something inside him clicked. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about making sure that the power in that notebook didn't destroy everything they had left. We can do this, Jamal said, his voice steady now, his fear replaced by determination. We have to. His father smiled, a rare, proud smile. That's my boy. With that, they turned and started moving again, deeper into the woods. Jamal's mind was focused, his body tired but resolute. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he was no longer running from his past. He was running toward his future. As they moved through the trees, the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. The men were close. But Jamal was ready. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He had a purpose. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The battle was just beginning. And Jamal was ready to fight for everything he believed in. As Jamal and his father made their way deeper into the woods, the air seemed to grow heavier, the tension thick enough to cut through. Every step they took was one closer to the unknown, one closer to whatever lay ahead. Jamal's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his father's words, the mysterious notebook, the danger that seemed to follow them like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world as he knew it was about to change forever. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Jamal could feel the heat of the pursuit, the cold sweat on his brow. They had no time to waste. His father led the way, moving with an urgency that Jamal had never seen before. There was no turning back now. The people chasing them weren't just after the notebook, they were after power. And Jamal knew that if they succeeded, everything would be lost. They reached a clearing, the trees parting to reveal an old stone structure half hidden by overgrown vines. It looked like a forgotten ruin, a place that time had left behind. Jamal's father stopped and turned to him. This is it, he said, his voice low but firm. We have to make our stand here. They won't stop until they get what they want. Jamal nodded, his grip tightening around the notebook. His heart was racing, but he wasn't scared anymore. He understood now. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting the future. He couldn't let them take the notebook, couldn't let them use its power for their own twisted purposes. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and a figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was followed by two others, both armed and ready for a fight. Jamal's stomach tightened as he recognized the leader. He had seen him in the shadows before, a figure from his father's past. Give it to us, and we'll let you both walk away, the man said, his voice cold and threatening. Jamal's father stepped forward, standing between Jamal and the men. You don't understand what you're asking for, he said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of anger. The power in that notebook isn't something you can control. It will destroy you. The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. You're too late. We've already figured it out. We know what it can do. And now, we'll take it from you. Jamal felt a surge of fear. But it was quickly replaced by something stronger, defiance. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not after everything. Not after everything his father had sacrificed. He stepped forward, standing beside his father, the notebook still clutched tightly in his hands. "We won't let you have it," Jamal said, his voice firm, his resolve clear. "We'll fight for it. We'll fight for what's right." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand moving to the weapon at his side. "You're making a mistake, boy." Before he could make a move, Jamal's father lunged forward, his own weapon in hand. A shot rang out, echoing through the clearing. Jamal flinched, but his father was already moving, taking down one of the men with swift precision. The other two advanced, their weapons raised, but Jamal felt a fire inside him, a determination he had never known before. He didn't think. He just acted. Jamal darted forward, using the element of surprise to his advantage. He grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it at one of the men. It struck him in the chest, knocking him back. The man stumbled, losing his balance, and Jamal took the opportunity to knock the weapon from his hand. His father was still engaged in a fierce struggle with the leader, each of them fighting for control, for dominance. Jamal could see the intensity in his father's eyes, the years of hidden conflict and danger that had led to this moment. It was clear that this wasn't just about the notebook anymore. This was personal. The leader, seething with rage, turned his attention to Jamal. "You think you can stop me?" he spat. "You're nothing." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He held his ground, the notebook still in his grip. "I'm not nothing," he said, his voice steady. "I'm the one who decides what happens next." The leader lunged at him, but Jamal was quicker. With a swift move, he dodged, using the momentum to throw the man off balance. The leader fell hard to the ground, stunned. Jamal's father stood over him, his weapon raised. "It's over," he said, his voice cold. "You won't hurt anyone else." The leader glared up at them, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over. You can't stop us. There are more of us. There's always more." But Jamal wasn't listening anymore. He was focused on the notebook, his hands trembling as he held it. This was the moment he had to decide what to do with the power it held. He looked at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Jamal took a deep breath and opened the notebook. As the pages flipped, he felt a surge of energy, a strange, almost electric sensation that ran through his body. The notebook wasn't just a record, it was a map, a guide to something much larger, something that could change the world. But Jamal knew what he had to do. The power in the notebook was too dangerous, too volatile to be controlled. He couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. With a swift motion, he ripped the pages from the notebook, scattering them to the wind. As they fluttered away, Jamal felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The power was gone, lost to the world. The leader, still on the ground, watched in disbelief. "You fool," he snarled. "You've just doomed us all." Jamal didn't reply. He didn't need to. The fight was over. The danger had passed. For now. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Jamal and his father stood together, breathing heavily but alive. They had won. They had stopped the men who sought to control the power of the notebook. But Jamal knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But he was ready. He had his father by his side, and together, they could face anything. The world had changed, but Jamal had found his place in it. He wasn't just a lost teen anymore. He was a survivor. And as he looked toward the horizon, he knew that the future was his to shape. And with that, the story of Jamal and his father came to an end, at least for now. But the journey, the fight for what was right, would continue.